Hey guys, today we'll be covering some tips and tricks on future bass. Here's an example drop that I made that we'll be covering today. There are many different ways of approaching future bass, and I would definitely recommend experimenting and finding your own style, but there are a couple core features that usually make up a future bass track. Usually you'll find a chord synth that's usually either a supersaw or maybe a square. You'll also find some almost trap inspired drums, and also usually an 808 sub bass or a similar bass that has a very warm tone to it, so a lot of content in the mid range. You'll also find little extra melodies and things dotted about the track to kind of keep it interesting. Today we'll be mainly covering the chord synths and the drums. So once you've got your new project open, I would recommend putting your tempo to whatever suits you. Usually you'll find that future bass sits around the same tempo as dubstep, but you can really experiment with what you want. For this project I used 135 BPM because I felt that that fit the best. To start off, I'm going to go ahead and go to utilities and drag in a combinator to make everything tidy. Then I'm going to drag in a mixer. And if you press tab, you should check that it's auto-routed correctly. And yeah, the master out is going to the from devices. Next up, we're going to go to instruments and we're going to drag in a maelstrom right under the mixer. Chord synth I made was comprised of 3 layers, the mid-range, the high-end, and then a bit in between, which was placed at an interval of 7. This helps to fill up the spectrum evenly and create a nice full sounding chord synth. So starting off, we're going to right click on maelstrom and we're going to reset the device. We're going to enable oscillator B, and we're going to also set these both to sawtooth 16. We're going to detune these layers to around 20 each. And then we're also going to bring up the attack maybe to around 30, 40, just so that it's not as sharp. We're going to disable these filters by clicking on them, making sure they're unticked. We're also going to spread these 2 oscillators with this dial here. We're going to go up to around 49. And because we're working on the low mids layer for this synth, we're going to bring the octave down to 2 on both oscillators. We're also going to bring the shift up a bit on these oscillators, so I'm going to put this one at 6 and the next one at 8. Now, after opening up the sequencer and penciling in some notes, this is what it should sound like on one note. We're going to utilize one of Reason's players to generate a chord from this one note. So we're going to go to players on the left and we're going to drag in scales and chords just over the maelstrom. And hearing it on default should sound like this. We're going to set the key to E and minor. We're also going to put the number of notes up to 4. And we're also going to enable octave down here, which will give us an extra note at the bottom. And this is what it sounds like now. Now next I wanted to run one of the oscillators through the shaper, so I enabled the shaper by clicking here, putting it on clip, and then putting the amount to a 64, and then clicking on this button to route the oscillator through the shaper. This ended up giving the sound a bit more bite, and now it sounds like this. Next I wanted some more saturation, so I dragged soft tube saturation knob down below this synth, and added it in, and put it to around 2.3. This rack extension is free, so it's easily accessible to anyone that wants to follow this tutorial. This is what it should sound like with the saturation applied. Next we're going to do the top end layer, so we're going to drag the scales and chords out of the combinator and hold shift while we do it so that it reroutes it above. And we're going to go to instruments and drag in another maelstrom just under the mixer. Again we're going to right click on this new one and click reset device. And again we're going to enable oscillator B, put these both to sawtooth 16, add a bit more attack to both oscillators, and then put the spread all the way. We're also going to detune these slightly left and right, and this is what we should get now. Now together the chord should sound a bit like this. As you can hear, with the top end layered in, it adds a bit more shine to the sound. And lastly we're going to do the other mid layer. So we're going to drag in another maelstrom right under this mixer, right click to reset device, and we're going to enable oscillator B, put them both on sawtooth 16. We're going to put the octave down to 3, put the shift to around 16 and 6 respectively, and also put the sense up to 11 and then a minus 11. And the important part is on this synth we're going to push the semitones up to 7 to create the 5th. This is what the chords should sound like now. On this last synth that we just made, we're going to be adding a widening plugin by Polyverse called Wider, and we're going to be putting this to around 50% width. This is a great plugin for widening as it's mono compatible and doesn't mess with your mix. Now with that applied, this is what it sounds like. Next up we can drag in a reverb, so I'm going to go to effects and go to the RV7000 reverb and drag it below the mixer to route it as a send. And we're going to use just the plate spread here, and we're going to send all of these channels to the reverb just slightly. We're going to bring down the return a bit so that it's not as loud. We're also going to enable the EQ and click here to open up the programmer. And we're going to click on EQ and then bring down the low gain around 300 Hz just to roll off that low end. Now the reverb sounds quite quiet now, but when we add compression after, it will bring it out. Another classic feature of a future-based saw is the LFO on the volume. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Utilities and grab Pulsar. And we're going to route the CV to the master CV level here. We're also going to open up the programmer of the combinator. We're going to click on Pulsar here, and we click on Receive Notes. That way, every time you click a key, it will trigger the envelope here when we put the envelope sync on. So this means that the LFO will start fresh again every time you press a new key. Just for ease of future use, we're going to program this combinator to also map these dials to the rate and the level for future control. So we're going to click on Pulsar here. We're going to go to Rotary 1. And we're going to go to LFO 1, rate synced. We're going to go to Rotary 2, LFO 1 level. So this dial now controls the level, and this dial controls the rate now. This is what the level controls. And this is what the rate controls. For this song I wanted to use triplets on the LFO, so I set the rate to 1/8 triplets, which is around 101 on this dial. And this is what it should sound like. For some final touch-ups that I wanted to do, I added a Fab Filter Saturn. I hold Shift when I drag in just so I can route this in. And then I went ahead and soloed the mid channel. And I added some heavy saturation on the mids. I found around 33% was nice. And on the bottom end and the top end, I put some gentle saturation. And I pushed these up to around 70%. Now with everything played together, this is what it should sound like. I felt that the mids were a bit lacking, so I pushed them up a bit to around 3.9. And then lastly, I added in a plugin called Gain Reduction, which is just a nice compressor. So I put this dial down to 34, and this one down to 18. And this is what it should sound like. As you can hear, it brings out the reverb too. I then automated the level of the LFO by automating this dial in the track. And you can either just pencil in or record some automations using a controller. But, you know, just playing it by ear is fine. I found a curve like this worked quite well on the start of the track. I went ahead and pasted the MIDI I did from the track earlier, but for songwriting you can use whatever kind of chords you want, obviously, and you can change the key here and even the scales as well. Or you can do the chords yourself if you prefer to do it that way. So with that all together, this is what it sounds like now. So next onto the drums, I looked around for some good sample backs that were made for future bass. And I found these Cymatics Jack U drums. Went to the kicks, and I think I used kick 39. I dragged that in onto the sequencer right there. For the snare, I used a different sample pack. I went and found some claps. So I used 2, 5, and 14. So using my technique from the last video I made, we're going to use one of these as the main fundamental transient, and the rest are going to be used for the body and the tail. So we're going to drag this snare onto the 3 here. And we're also going to make sure that this snare lines up with the 3. So we're going to disable snap and line up these snares correctly. So I use snare number 5 as my main transient, and the other 2 I used for the body and the tail. So I'm going to grab this handle and drag in the start of the snare and do the same for this one, and play around with it until it sounds right. Now this main snare number 5 has got to come up a bit, and snare 14 down a bit. And just to make routing easier, we're going to select all 3 of these tracks, and then we're going to route these to a new output bus and name it snare. For this track, I wanted the kicks and the snares to follow the basses and the chords. So then what I did is I copied and pasted the drums to fit with the chords themselves. So they should follow like this. Now, as you write the track, you'll constantly be making edits to this and making the drums and the basses play well together. But for this song, I really wanted the drums to emphasize those hits whenever they happened. We also obviously have to sidechain all the basses and the chords to the drums, so we will do that at the end. For the other synth in this song, I wanted to have a nice staccato synth. So I went and dragged in a Europa, and I had a look through the presets. So I clicked on Browse Patch up here, and then I found the one called Stroll. This is what this synth sounds like with a simple chord. So I realized that envelope 2 was controlling the rate of the plug, so I changed this to triplets to fit the other sound. And now it sounds a bit more like this. I also wanted the sound to open up a bit as the chord gets sustained, so I clicked on Engine 2 and saw that there was a low pass filter, and then right clicked on the frequency, edited the automation, and then I drew in a ramp below here. Next I went to Effects, and I dragged in a Scream 4 just underneath. And I set this to tape, put the damage control to around 40, and I disabled the body. I also added in the soft tube saturation knob and put this to around 1.9. Next I wanted to add in a more aggressive distortion but in parallel so that I don't affect the whole signal. So what I did is I went to Utilities and dragged in a line mixer 6x2, holding shift so that it doesn't create new cables. Then I put the audio out here, and like this. Then I went to Effects and I dragged in a Scream 4 distortion right here so that it adds it as a send effect. I set the distortion to modulate, and here are all the settings if you want to look at it. But the main thing is I set the send to 80, and I set the return to 74. So now this is what it should sound like. Next up, we're going to add the sidechaining. So like in the previous tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and add in my dynamic control plugin from Dorincourt. I'm going to open the show devices. I'm also going to route this output here. And I'm going to hit this button so I can then adjust the length of the kick. Bring the level up as well. And then I'm going to route the dynamics of both of the chord synths up to this plugin. Then I'm going to go to the mixer by hitting F5, and then I'm going to go to the compression settings up here. And as you can see, these two channels are from my previous track, so this is the compression settings I use for the sidechain. So if you want to copy these, then feel free to do so. Now with the sidechain, we're obviously going to have to write it in to trigger on the kick and the snare. So we're going to right click on this red drum, and then we're going to press the comma key to create two tracks on this. We're going to pencil in a track here, and then making sure snap is on, we're then going to draw in a note here. We're going to copy this for every single kick that we see, and we're also going to do the same for the snares, but on the other channel. With the sidechaining, it should sound a bit more like this. So as you can hear, the levels are a bit loud, so we're going to bring those down, and in the final mix down, everything will be leveled out nicely. The next important element is the 808 sub bass. And because this would take too long to explain in full detail, I'm going to link a Propellerhead video that explains exactly how to make this bass. So I'm going to right click and paste in this track. And because I'm sideshading using the M-class compressor, I'm then going to flip this around, and I'm going to route my combi input into my sidechain signal. So this is what the sub bass should sound like without any sidechaining. And with the sidechaining set to as hard as possible and as fast as possible, with a release around 110 milliseconds, this is what it should sound like. This just allows the kick and the snare to have their transient room, and if you don't sidechain the kick especially, you'll end up with some phase issues on the low end. So with the kick and the snare, this is what it should sound like. So altogether, with a bit of leveling and mixing, this is what it should sound like so far. So it sounds nice, but it's lacking one main feature, which is the hi-hats. So what I did is I pulled out a Kong drum designer, and then I opened up the patch browser here. I then went to Kong kits, and I looked around and tried to find something I liked. I found out that I liked the AA12 from Bomb Squad. Now there are two main layers that I use here. Here's the stick and the hi-hat. I really like the stick because even though it's supposed to be a rim shot, it sounded almost like a hi-hat, so I mainly use this sound. And I didn't want it pan too much, so I reset the pan here by pressing Control and clicking. Then what I did is I went to Players and I dragged in Propeller's new drum sequencer. And I went ahead and unticked the kick drums here. I then wanted to make sure that the snare was learnt to the rim shot, so I clicked on snare and I clicked learn, and then I clicked on the stick here. And I wanted to do the same for the close hi-hat, so I clicked on close hi-hat, make sure that learn is still selected, and then click on the hi-hat. As you see, it updates. Then you want to unclick learn, and you should be good to go. You can also just link the two pads by clicking on this link button here. So if we link it to group D, every time you hit one, the other one will trigger too. But I wanted the individual control of the velocities over both, so let's unlink them. So then you can play around with the patterns as you wish. You can obviously just draw in patterns like this and play around with the velocities. This is going to be a straight regular eighth note. You can also do triplets by doing 3 in a row and then just dragging up on the repeat section until you find the 3-4. And then you'll get some triplets. Once you find a pattern that you like, you could then make a new pattern on any of these other pattern selections, and then you can automate this while the song is playing to then change the pattern in real time. So say that you want one section with 16th notes, you can just go ahead and draw these in, and then when you press play, you can see because pattern 3 is selected, we'll get this, but then if we want 1, we can also automate it to switch back to 1, and we'll have the regular pattern. This is really cool for creating new fills and variances in your song. These are the patterns that I ended up with in the song, and if you want to learn how to use drum sequencer in more depth, Propellerhead has a great tutorial on their channel for it. So now with the hi-hats merged with the rest of the song, this is what it should sound like. So lastly, I wanted to round out the song with a few little additions here and there. So I have this synth from Output called Arcade, which gives you a lot of different samples that you can choose from. So I chose a few that I liked and I placed them throughout the track, and then added on top, this is what it sounds like soloed. And then mixed into the track, this is what it sounds like. So the last thing that we're missing is a tom fill. You can use whatever samples you want, but for this track I decided to use some of Kong's synthesis. So I went ahead and dragged in another Kong, and then I went to browse the patches. I went to acoustic kits and I found this modeled acoustic kit, which is quite nice. And it has some nice synthesized toms in there. These toms ring out quite a long time, so what I want to do is reduce the decay on each of them. But not too much to deaden them. Once those are all done, you can get to writing the MIDI. So because a lot of this song is done in triplets, we're going to set the snap to 16 triplets, and we're going to pencil in our MIDI. I want this tom fill just before the next bar starts, so right around here. So I'm going to set my loop points by holding Alt and clicking, and then Control and clicking, just so it's on this part here. I'm going to place the high tom right here, and we're going to copy that down to the mid tom. We're going to turn the snap off by clicking S or clicking here, and then we're going to drag this tom slightly late to create a flam. Next, we're going to turn the snap back on, and we're going to hold Control while dragging to copy the note. And we're going to swap this high tom down to the mid tom, and this mid tom down to the low tom. So it should sound like this now. And then we do the same for the low tom, so we copy it and then move them. So altogether now it should sound like this. After that, I just added in a pulverizer and I reset it and made sure that the filter was bypassed and put the squash to 16 and the dirt to 6, and then added in another saturation knob at 0.5% and put it on keep low. So after all that, this is what it should sound like together. So I hope these tips and tricks have helped you out in any way. Big thanks to Propellerhead for getting me to make these videos. And if you want to try out a 30-day trial of Reason, there's a link in the description. So until next time, I'll see you later. Bye.